Hello and welcome to Lecture 5 of the Baroque era. Last time we started talking about instrumental music, and I'm going to continue today specifically talking about the concerto, and I'll talk about the composer Antonio Vivaldi, and I think towards the end, if we have time, we'll also talk about another different genre of instrumental music called the suite. So, just to review, I introduced the idea of the concerto, the genre of instrumental music known as the concerto, and I'd said that there were two major types of concerto, and we have an example of one of each type in the listening in your book. So we have a concerto by J.S. Bach, just the first movement of his Brandenburg Concerto No. 5. That's an example of a concerto grosso. That's the type which has an orchestra, but also a small group that is kind of like within the orchestra, but it is sort of like the featured soloists. And there are times when we just hear this small group playing, and then there are times where we hear the entire ensemble playing. And if we hear the entire ensemble, this is a tutti section. Tutti simply meaning all in Italian, all the players are playing. And that small group, which we sometimes hear by itself, is called the concertino, which is basically the Italian word for small group. And we also I talked about how the concerto is almost always a three-movement genre. So we have three different movements which have contrasting moods and especially contrasting tempos. So the first movement is almost always fast, the second movement is slow, and the third movement is fast again. And we also have a certain kind of form, structure associated with the fast movements, that is, the first and last movement of the concerto, which we call ritornello form. And the idea of ritornello form is we have a main melody, which we hear at the beginning of the movement, called the ritornello. And it's simply the Italian word for the thing that returns, the melody which returns periodically throughout the movement. And that ritornello kind of provides an overarching sense of continuity to the movement. In between the appearances of the ritornello, we have these contrasting episodes. And usually in the contrasting episodes, that's where we hear the soloists, either the individual soloist, if it's a solo concerto, or the small group, the concertino, if it's a concerto grosso. And the idea of the appearances of the soloist is very often to sort of show off your technical skill on the instrument, whether that instrument is a violin, which is really the most common instrument to feature as a soloist, or the keyboard, or it could be, let's say, a flute, could be a cello, or an oboe, or a bassoon. Composers wrote many, many different types of or let's say different formats, different featured soloists within this concerto genre, but the violin and the keyboard were the most common. So that's the form that we find in the first and the last movement of a concerto. That middle movement is not usually in ritornello form, but the first and last movements are. The ritornello melody will be different in, let's say, the first movement versus the last movement. It'll be a different melody, but it will have that same kind of structure. So different content, but similar form. Okay, so that's just a brief recap of the idea of the concerto, and we'll see how this specifically kind of plays out, particularly in this concerto, this particular concerto, which is in your listening, in the section where they talk about Antonio Vivaldi on page 133. So we'll also talk a little bit about Vivaldi. And Vivaldi, when we start talking about Vivaldi now, we're kind of getting into the late Baroque. So we will talk about three late Baroque composers in particular, generally considered to be the three greatest composers of the late Baroque. And they are Antonio Vivaldi, born 1678, and then J.S. Bach, and George Frederick Handel, both of whom were born only about a month apart in the year 1685. So we'll talk about those in subsequent lectures. Today we'll focus on Vivaldi. So Vivaldi, as you could probably guess by his name, Antonio Vivaldi, was Italian. He was, first of all, probably the greatest violinist of his day. And even to this day, his violin music is still within the repertoire. It's something that all violinists, they learn his concertos and his other pieces. Vivaldi wrote all kinds of music, every different type of genre that we will look at in the Baroque. Vivaldi composed it, but he is best known for his concertos. He wrote 450 concertos of various types, concerto grosso, solo concerto, and his solo concertos for lots of different instruments. Most of them are violin concertos, but he wrote for other solo instruments in conjunction with the orchestra as well. And all of this was done within his role, within his main job that he had for his career, which was as a priest slash music teacher at an orphanage for girls who were not really orphans. Let me explain a little bit about why this is. And actually, this is kind of interesting because it ties into a bit the role of women in music and in society in a way, not only in the Baroque era, but maybe to a certain extent going back into the Renaissance, and certainly going forward into our next two eras, into the classical era, into the Romantic era. So the things that I'm going to say about women and music, beginning here in the Baroque, are largely carry on well into the 19th century. That is the 1800s. Although here we're starting out, let's say, in the late 1600s, the 1700s. So why would we need to have an orphanage for girls who were not orphans? Well, these girls were at this quote unquote orphanage, this school, this institution really for young girls called the Pietà. That's the name of the place in Vivaldi's case. This is in Venice. Remember, Venice is one of the leading cultural centers, if not the musical capital, the unofficial musical capital of Europe during the, let's say, the mid to late Baroque. There were many such institutions, though, throughout Europe. And the reason they existed is because these girls were not orphans, they were born out of wedlock. Then, as now, sometimes, people had children before they got married. But you would deal with this situation differently depending on whether the child turned out to be a boy or a girl. So let's say you are you're a young man or a young woman and you have a boyfriend or a girlfriend, and you perhaps inadvertently get pregnant. What you might do, you might go ahead and marry. If your family if your families approve, if you might just go ahead and get married and sort of spare yourself whatever societal embarrassment you might suffer as a result of having the child out of wedlock before you had a chance to get married. But what people often did actually back then is they would wait to see if they wanted to get married, depending on whether the baby turned out to be a boy or a girl. And the reason for this is, of course, boys were preferred for a number of reasons. One important reason, which we don't really think of today, I mean, you could probably think of maybe some obvious reasons, but one that you might not realize is the institution of the dowry. So remember, in those days, if you are certainly of, let's say, middle class and above, if you were a father of a daughter, the idea was one day your daughter would marry. Right? This is before the idea of women having a career. This is well before that concept really was in operation. And so the only prospects really for girls in those days were either to be married, or maybe to become a nun, go into a convent, or sadly in some cases to become a prostitute. All right, there are not a lot of options, and by far, marrying and starting a family was considered the best option. But if you're the father of a daughter, you are going to have to pay somebody, the family of the young man your daughter would marry someday. You'd have to pay them a dowry. That's just what was done. So that meant if you were young and maybe not so well off and you had a daughter out of wedlock, that daughter represented kind of a burden. You would, in order for her to have a good future, to be married off, you'd have to pay someone's family in order to marry her to their son. On the other hand, if you had a son, that means someday someone would pay you a dowry so that your son could marry their daughter. So for various reasons, you might wait, see if the baby once born was a boy. If it was a boy, you might go ahead and get married. If it was a girl, you might basically give the girl up and take this baby girl to one of these institutions like the Pietà, where Vivaldi worked. And these places were usually run by the church, run by priests, monks, perhaps nuns, and a convent. And there would even be a special place where you could drop off the baby, so that, again, you could sort of, you didn't want to make it too difficult for people to do this. You wanted to make it easy for them to drop off their baby, maybe in the middle of the night. So you would actually have, in the side of the building very often, there would be a little compartment, a sort of a window or a door, where you would lift up this door on the outside of the building, put your baby on a sort of a lazy Susan type thing, and then close the door and turn the wheel so that now the baby is on the inside of the wall. And then there'd be a string, a little bell. You'd ring the bell, wake up the priests or the monks or the nuns, and then walk away, go on with your life. And now your daughter would spend probably the next at least, 13, 14 years of her life being raised by the monks or the priests or the nuns at a place like the Pietà. And so now, well, what are the staff, people like Vivaldi and others who worked in this position, what are they going to do with these young girls? Well, one of the things you would want to do is to train them in music. You'd want to educate them as well as possible, teach them all the things that you would learn in school, but you'd also want to teach them music, not so that they could become professional musicians. Again, this is at a time when, women were generally not expected to become professional anything, but they were expected to be, that again, if you were of middle class and higher, a young woman was expected to be a good amateur musician. And some of them were actually excellent musicians, because that would make them more attractive as potential brides, right? Because the idea is, if you are, looking for a wife, all else being equal, you would want one who is a good musician, because, you come home after a long day of work and your wife might, play something on the harpsichord or on the violin or sing a song, and she might also teach your children music, right? So it was considered an important asset. And so this is the reason why very often what was taught at these kind of schools was music. Kind of as a side note, so I said that women were generally not professional musicians, but very often skilled amateurs. There are a couple of exceptions to this, and the book mentions a couple of the more prominent women composers of the time. None of them really became particularly famous as any of the male composers, certainly. And even within the realm of performing, you would think, okay, well, if you've got an opera, certainly you need women to sing the female roles in an opera. And yes, that was very often done. But it was considered kind of unseemly in these days for a woman of a certain class to perform in front of people, either as a musician or as an actor. This is not like today where being a musician or being an actor was seen as a very glamorous thing, being an entertainer. It was seen as kind of a low-class thing, actually. and it would be sort of like beneath the dignity of a lady to perform in this way. And for this reason, for other reasons as well, but in an opera, for example, sometimes the female roles would be sung by men dressed as women. And sometimes they would be sung by castrati. I don't know if you've heard of castrati. It's kind of a painful subject. What a castrato is, castrati would be plural, it's a man who would have been castrated before puberty in order to retain their high voice. And this was very common in those days. And in fact, the castrati were kind of like the rock stars of their day. They were some of the highest paid and most in-demand performers of, let's say, the 17th century, the 18th century. We get into the 19th century, that it's considered kind of brutal and barbaric, and there are no more castrati, really. But they were very common in the Baroque era. And the idea was to retain that high voice, but also to have a male physique. So even though the voice would not change, castrati would grow to be full-size men with the power of a male voice and with the greater lung capacity, right? And remember, if you're singing opera, you've got to fill a big opera house. You've got to be able to sing above an orchestra, project your voice, and just the male physique is generally kind of better suited for this. You've got bigger lungs, etc., all things being equal. And so this was the idea behind the castrato. So again, even the female roles in many Baroque operas were sung by men who had been castrated as boys. So anyway, let's talk a little bit about Vivaldi. As the book mentions, he was a towering figure of the late Baroque, recognized as the greatest violinist of his time, also a great violin teacher, very influential. And a very prolific composer, composed all kinds of pieces, all these different genres that we will talk about. Vivaldi composed them all, but he is best known for his concertos. He composed about 450 concertos of various kinds, in addition to all the other music he composed, operas, sonatas, etc. He was a Catholic priest, but again, he wasn't like the pastor of a church. He was a priest working in this institution for quote-unquote orphaned girls, the Pietà in Venice. Sadly, toward the end of his life, Vivaldi's music, for whatever reason, it kind of maybe fell out of fashion. He was not as famous. After he died, his music was kind of forgotten and went into obscurity, and was kind of rediscovered, actually maybe in the mid-20th century or so, and has enjoyed an incredible revival to the point today where I'm sure you've heard Vivaldi's music before, but maybe just not realized it. And probably his most familiar piece is this particular violin concerto called La Primavera, or Spring. It's the first of a set of 4 concertos, which Vivaldi collectively titled The Seasons. So we have one concerto for each of the different seasons. Spring, beginning with spring, summer, fall, and winter. Each of these concertos is a separate piece with 3 movements. All right, so we're just going to look at the spring concerto. And sort of a side note here, the spring concerto, notice that there's a description in the title of what the piece is about. It's purely instrumental music. There are no words being sung, but there's a storyline. And in fact, Vivaldi writes out the storyline, a description of what is being depicted in the music. He wrote this little poem, actually, a different poem for each season, and actually had it written into the score, into the music, so that the performers would know what it is that they were supposed to be imitating, what kind of a picture they were supposed to be creating for the audience. This kind of thing is known as program music. So this is an important term that we will we'll come back to later on, especially when we get to the 19th century, the Romantic era. Program music is very much in fashion during that time, but we see some examples of it here in the 17th century, the 18th century. So program music is simply instrumental music which has a descriptive title of some kind where the composer wants to tell a story or paint a picture, and he wants the audience to know what that story is. And that's why there's a descriptive title, like Spring. So that even if there's nothing else but the word spring in the title, there's a suggestion to the listener, if he knows what the title is, and he's already sort of primed to imagine spring or whatever it is that the title is describing. So that's program music, and it really only applies to purely instrumental music, because obviously if we have words, like if we have an opera or an oratorio and there are words, well, the words tell us what the story is. Or maybe in the case of an opera, you've got people acting on stage and you can see the story. But this is purely instrumental music where there are no words, at least in the music itself, to help you understand what the story is about. So the composer has to suggest it in other ways, by the descriptive title and by maybe doing things within the music itself. For example, imitating the sounds of birds or of rushing streams or gentle breezes or whatever. And we're going to hear some of that in this particular concerto. So again, going back to Vivaldi a little bit, Vivaldi worked in this institution, this orphanage, and this place actually came to be quite famous and well regarded as sort of like a tourist stop for people making a traveling through Europe, especially people who are interested in music. You would go to Venice, sort of like the unofficial musical capital of Europe in the Baroque era. And you might well, on a Sunday, want to go to the Pietà to hear a public performance by this all-girl orchestra and choir. About 40 girls at any given time would perform in these regular Sunday concerts, and Vivaldi was the conductor, would compose the music specifically for them to perform. And this orchestra of like tween or teenage young girls was actually one of the best orchestras in Europe during this time. They were renowned, and people came from far and wide to hear them play. You would not be able to see them, however. You could hear them but not see them, because they would perform behind a screen. Right? They would put a screen up on stage, sort of a lattice, so that you could hear the sound but not see them, because again, it was considered maybe lewd or risque to have young girls playing instruments, performing for you on stage. It might seem a little strange to us, but again, that was sort of like the ethos of the time. So let's talk a little bit about this particular concerto, the first of the 4 concertos collectively titled The Seasons. And I will play some just little snippets from the listening guides, which are embedded in your book. Remember, you can also find any of these listening examples in the playlists of the YouTube channel. Just look for playlists and look for Baroque era, and you'll be able to find these different movements. All 3 of these movements, by the way, there are listening guides, so I could put them in your listening ID questions on the test. So make sure you can identify not just like the first movement of the Spring Concerto, but the second movement, the third movement. Remember, one of the ways to tell these different movements apart is the first and last movements will have a fast tempo, the middle movement will have a slower tempo. But also, if you pay attention to the different little features of this particular piece, which are described in the listening guide, which I'm going to talk about a little bit now, you'll have something to sort of grab onto, like, oh yeah, that's the sound of that's the ritornello melody, and that's the chirping birds, and that's the murmuring brook, or what have you, okay? So, I'm going to try and tie together how the form of the concerto works, the ritornello form, with this particular little description, this poem that Vivaldi wrote. You might not realize it's a poem, but it's actually a sonnet. If you're familiar with a sonnet typically is 14 lines, and it's sort of like 8 lines followed by 6 lines. And the first 8 lines of this little poem that Vivaldi wrote and had written into the music describe the first movement. And then we have 3 lines to describe what's going on in the second movement, and another 3 lines to describe what's going on in the last movement. And all this is outlined for you on pages 134 through 136 in the Camian text, if we have the 2025 version. Okay, so first movement, allegro, fast tempo. And here's what Vivaldi wants us to hear. He says, "Spring has come, and joyfully the birds greet it with a happy song." So we should hear some kind of happy, upbeat, spring-like music, joyful music. And that's certainly, I think, the character of the ritornello melody. This familiar. I'll just play a little bit of snippet of it on my little keyboard here. All right, you've probably heard that before. That's at least the first phrase of the ritornello melody. So we hear the ritornello melody. We hear it repeated. We hear it first a little louder and then a little softer. Terraced dynamics, remember? The idea of sudden contrast of loud and soft, terrace dynamics. We can hear that actually as this theme is restated. And then we hear, spring has come, and joyfully the birds greet it with a happy song. So we should hear something that sounds like chirping birds. And this is the first solo section. So the solo violinist, who's playing in conjunction with the orchestra, plays this little like tweeting, chirping bird sounds. And he's actually, he or she, probably be a she originally, when this piece was first performed. The concert mistress or the concert master, the first violin in the orchestra, would also join in the chirping. So we can hear multiple birds chirping back and forth to each other. So we hear birds chirping. And then the streams, fanned by gentle breezes, flow along with a sweet murmur. So we should hear like murmuring streams, gentle breezes. Then, covering the sky with a black cloak, thunder and lightning come to announce the season. When these have quieted down, the little birds return to their enchanting song. So we hear a thunderstorm. And what we will hear is the low strings giving us sort of the rumbling of thunder, and then these sort of rapid scale passages in the upper strings depicting the lightning. And you'll hear that they're out of sync from each other. We hear the lightning, we sort of see the lightning, but the lightning is depicted by these flashy, rapid violin passages, and then we hear this rumbling of thunder. It's sort of like in nature, right? You see the lightning first, and then you hear the thunder, right? So even this kind of detail, Vivaldi has thought of it. When the thunderstorm passes, the little birds return to their enchanting song. So the birds come out after the storm passes, and we hear the ritornello melody at the end to close things off. So let's listen to this first movement of the, if I can conjure it up on my computer, the first movement of La Primavera, the Spring Concerto. And I'll just describe some of these things as they happen. But you can also follow along with your listening guide, and it's pretty obvious. Okay, so first thing, ritornello melody. Notice it's softer. That's your terrace dynamics. So the same thing is repeated, but softer. Louder. It's not terribly loud, it's a small orchestra. And then softer. Terrace dynamics. Okay, so this is our ritornello melody. We'll hear bits of it come back, but here's our chirping birds. 2 violinists, the soloist and the first violin in the orchestra. And it sounds just random enough to sound like birdsong. I mean, it's musical, it's structured, but it has a kind of a slightly random bird chirping quality about it. And then the ritornello melody comes back. So this is a tutti section. The whole orchestra is playing. Now here's one of our contrasting sections. This is the murmuring stream. You can imagine sort of a babbling brook. And this, I believe, coming up is the gentle breezes. And you can almost imagine maybe trees swaying in the breeze while the brook runs below. Ritornello melody comes back. And now here's the thunder and lightning. Thunder, lightning, thunder. And now the solo violinist has this flashy, difficult passages. Remember, that's the idea of a concerto, is to show off the virtuosity, the technique of the soloist. Ritornello melody comes back. It's in a minor key because we just went through a thunderstorm. But now that the storm is past, the birds are tentatively coming back out and starting to chirp and sing again. And the sky is maybe still a little bit overcast. The sun hasn't quite come out yet. Here we have another tutti section. The whole orchestra is playing a theme that is based on the ritornello theme. And here's our final solo interlude. And then to bring things to a close, ritornello melody. And again, it's stated forte and then piano, terrace dynamics, loud and then soft. Okay, so that is the first movement of this concerto. What happens in the second movement? Well, we should expect a slower tempo, a different mood, and indeed, that's what we have. It's Vivaldi writes in the music as the tempo and the dynamic indication, largo y pianissimo sempre. So largo means slow, y pianissimo, and very soft, sempre, throughout, always. And here's what is being described in the music. And then, on a pleasant meadow, covered with flowers, lulled by the soft murmuring of leaves and branches, the goatherd sleeps, his faithful dog at his side. So how are you going to depict this musically, if you're Vivaldi? Well, there are three main features. There's the meadow itself. We have to somehow depict a pleasant meadow covered with flowers, and there's a soft murmuring of leaves and branches. We can imagine maybe the flowers waving back and forth, the leaves and branches. So that's one feature. And we hear that in the orchestral violins. And they have this this kind of murmuring feature. It's like so that's how Vivaldi kind of paints the backdrop of these murmuring leaves and branches. Then we have a sleeping goat herd. So we have a goat herd. He's out in the meadow with his herd of goats, but he's sleeping. And the sleeping goat herd is represented by the violin soloist, which plays this long, sort of dreamy melody, right? It's sort of surreal. It's not quite real. It has this quality of dreaminess about it, of not being real. And the book mentions this particular slow movement uses only the solo violin and the orchestral violins and violas. The cellos, basses, and harpsichord are left out. They don't play. And by leaving out the lower pitched stringed instruments and the harpsichord. I think this is what gives it this sort of dreamlike quality. It's not quite rooted in reality. It's not heavy. It's very light. It's ethereal. Okay, so we have the sleeping goatherd represented by the main melody, which you'll hear in the violin. And then the final feature is the faithful dog, right? So if the goatherd is sleeping, then somebody has to, keep an eye on the goats and bark at them once in a while to keep them from straying off, right? And that's why a goatherd or a shepherd would have a dog to help them kind of keep control over the herd. And so we can hear in every measure the violas imitate the sound of the barking dog. They're sort of like this sound. Right? So we combine those three elements, the murmuring of leaves and branches, the sleeping goatherd, represented by the solo violin, and then finally the barking dog. And we'll just hear a little bit of this, just the beginning of it. It sounds like this. You can hear the dog barking. And this melody, this is the dream of the goatherd. And you can hear in the background the orchestral violins, this murmuring melody. That's the leaves and branches and the flowers in the meadow. And you can hear it's also a very different mood from the first movement. The first movement was very kind of cheerful and upbeat. This is more ethereal and dreamy. It's in a minor key instead of a major key. So we have contrast of mood. Very important kind of feature of Baroque music. Contrasting from one movement to the next. So we have one basic mood in a given movement. We go to another movement and we have a different mood. Okay, let's move on to the last movement quickly, and that is what Vivaldi labels danza pastorale, pastoral dance, a dance out in the country, in a pasture, let's say. Remember this, and the whole theme of this, it's spring, we're outside, we're enjoying the leaves and branches and the sleeping as the dog looks after the herd of goats or what have you. In this case, the scene that we are now depicting is, to the festive sounds of country bagpipes dance nymphs and shepherds in their beloved fields, when spring appears in all its brilliance. I talked about nymphs and shepherds, I believe, in the Renaissance era, right? Whenever composers or poets want to depict the outdoors, there's usually some nymphs and shepherds involved. So here, we're back in ritornello form, so we should hear a ritornello melody. Also, we're going to have a faster tempo. It's a dance. It's happy, upbeat music. It's festive. We should hear something that sounds like bagpipes. And in fact, we do. We hear this, what we call a drone accompaniment, like what we have in... When you hear bagpipes and the guy is squashing down on that bag to produce the drone, we hear this kind of sound, usually an open fifth, and the melody is... Right? So we hear some fun dance-like melody and the imitation of bagpipes in a string orchestra. So let's listen to just a little bit of that. Final movement of the Spring Concerto. Oh, let's try it from the beginning. Go back here a little bit. All right, here we go. And again, we can hear these phrases which repeat loud and then soft. It's very dance-like and cheerful. This is the ritornello melody played by the tutti, the whole orchestra. And now a solo section played by the soloist. We hear this ascending sequence, difficult, rapid runs, Again, the idea of a concerto is to show off your technique a little bit. Ritornello melody comes back. The bagpipe sound. And again, this is a tutti section. The whole orchestra is playing. But we'll have another solo section coming up very soon, featuring the solo violin. Here it is. And the mood throughout is happy, upbeat, dance-like. Right? So, a little taste of the Vivaldi Spring Concerto. I encourage you to also look into the other concertos from the seasons, the summer and autumn and winter. They all have these wonderful poems and descriptions of stuff associated with these different seasons, which are brilliantly depicted in the music. But what I want to do now is, actually, we should probably check in on the other, just a little bit, on the other example of a concerto, which is in your book. And in order to do this, we have to go back actually to page 111. And I'm going to do that on my computer as well so that we can hear just a little bit of the Brandenburg Concerto number 5 by J.S. Bach. I'll talk more about J.S. Bach specifically in upcoming lectures, but just so that we can tie together. Now, this concerto by J.S. Bach is one of a set of 6. The Brandenburg Concertos are a set of 6 concertos that Bach composed and actually put them together and sent them off to a very high-ranking prince, the Margrave of Brandenburg, whom Bach was trying to perhaps get a job working for. It didn't work out, but because Bach sent these concertos to this Margrave, this prince of Brandenburg, they've been known as the Brandenburg Concertos ever since. This is number 5 of 6. This is a concerto grosso, so it involves an orchestra and a small group, right? Instead of an orchestra and soloist. This is a larger scale piece. It's bigger, it's longer, it's a bit more complex, but it still uses this ritornello form. We'll hear the ritornello at the very beginning, and then we'll hear these contrasting episodes featuring the small group. And in this case, the small group, the concertino, consists of harpsichord, violin, and flute. So that's the small group. And you'll hear them each sort of like taking turns presenting snippets of melody, etc. I won't play this whole example because it's just too long, but you should listen to the whole thing, especially towards the end of this. Now, this movement is about 10 minutes long. A little more than 10 minutes long, actually, I believe. Well, yeah, right about 10 minutes long. So almost as long as the entire Vivaldi concerto, all 3 movements. Just this first movement of this Bach Brandenburg Concerto is as long as an entire Vivaldi concerto. And towards the end of this first movement, there's a long harpsichord solo, which sounds in places almost like like 80s heavy metal guitar. It has a lot of the same kind of figures that you might hear in like a Led Zeppelin or a Van Halen guitar solo. And again, this would have been basically to show off the skill of the harpsichord player, which would have been Bach in this case, at least in the first performances of this piece. So very, very difficult and extended solo. By the way, when we have this kind of a solo for an instrument toward the end of a movement of a concerto, usually it's toward the end, this is often known as a cadenza. Cadenza is an extended solo for the soloist in a concerto. And this is something we find not so often in Baroque concertos, but definitely in concertos in the classical era, in the Romantic era. So the concerto as a genre is kind of invented in the Baroque, but it continues on into the next eras. It's still, in fact, today there are composers writing concertos. It's a very popular genre with audiences because they like to see a virtuoso performer backed up by an orchestra. The collaboration between the soloist and the big group is still something that audiences find exciting today. One thing that I want to point out about one feature that, again, we're trying to tie in the basic features of Baroque music, which we learned about in the first or second lecture, and try to plug them into these examples. This particular movement, the first movement of this Bach concerto, the ritornello melody is just, it's sort of like a run-on sentence. It's almost breathless. It's just continuous. So this is one of these features, especially of late Baroque music, where the melodies are very often continuous and they're almost like perpetual motion. All right, they are not broken up into phrases where you can take a breath at the end of the phrase. It's almost like it's just constant motion. I think you'll hear what I'm talking about as we listen to a little bit of the first movement. So we'll listen to just a bit of the first movement, and I'll point out the places where the tutti is playing the entire orchestra and places where the soloists. So here's the ritornello melody. A lot of notes. Now, here's the first appearance of the small group. And you can hear violin, flute, and harpsichord in the background. Notice how the violin and the flute kind of trade off with snippets of melody. So now the orchestra comes back in with that ritornello melody, and we have another contrasting section. Listen in particular, it's sort of in the background, but that harpsichord is just always going. Lots of notes in there. Orchestra comes back in with a snippet of the ritornello melody. And here again, the small group, violin and flute. And ritornello melody coming back in. Sometimes we don't hear the whole ritornello, we just hear enough of it to remind us, you know. Again, this is solo section. Not really solo, because again, it's a small group, it's the concertino. And we'll just listen a little bit more, maybe one more appearance of the ritornello. Orchestra comes back in with the ritornello. Okay, so make sure you listen to that entire movement of that Bach Brandenburg Concerto, but we're going to move on in the very few minutes I have remaining and introduce the next genre of instrumental piece, the Baroque suite. And this is described for you beginning on page 16. The Baroque suite is an instrumental piece which could be composed for a solo instrument, like keyboard, like J.S. Bach wrote many different suites for solo keyboard. He also wrote suites for violin, for cello. He wrote some suites for the lute. Remember, the lute is that guitar-like instrument, right? So it could be performed by a solo instrument, or it could be performed by a small group, like a chamber ensemble, or it could even be performed by an orchestra. So the example that they describe in your book of the suite happens to be an orchestral suite, again by J.S. Bach. But I would say actually most musicians more typically when they think of a suite, they think of a suite for a solo instrument. I would say Bach wrote far more suites, and Baroque composers generally wrote more suites for solo instruments than for small groups or for orchestras. I think they chose this particular orchestral suite as the example because it contains one movement in particular which is very familiar. It's known as the air on the G string. It's the second movement of this suite. But be that as it may, what is a suite? Well, the suite is basically now the title S-U-I-T-E, not S-W-E-E-T, but suite as in like a if you go to a hotel and you get a suite, you're not just getting a single room, you're getting multiple rooms, or a suit of clothes. It's not just a jacket or whatever. It's a matching jacket, pants, and maybe a vest, right? So anytime we have a suite of something, it implies multiples. And so a suite is a multi-movement piece, and a Baroque suite is specifically a multi-movement instrumental piece where each movement is modeled on a different type of dance. These different dance genres which were popular in the Baroque era. This is what we might call stylized dance music. What do I mean by stylized dance music? Meaning, a Baroque suite was not necessarily meant to, in fact, it was usually not, meant to accompany actual dancing. It was music for listening to, for sitting down and listening to, that was dance-like, that made you imagine the dance, perhaps, right? And where it has its origins, we could probably trace it back to the Renaissance. Do you remember how, when we talked about the dance music of the Renaissance in the previous unit, I said that very often composers would write dance music. Now, this would be music for actual dancing, too. And they would write pieces in pairs, like a slow dance followed by a fast dance. And they were meant to be performed together. And they would even share some musical material between them, perhaps. They would be in the same key, but they would be contrasting in rhythm and in tempo, corresponding to the different step, the different pace of these different dances, right? So if we take this idea and we expand it beyond the two movements to perhaps 4 movements, 5 movements, 6 movements, maybe even sometimes 7 movements, we have the Baroque suite. So it's sort of an evolution of the dance pair, which we talked about back in the Renaissance. The suite really has its origins in France. And this is because the French are, when it comes to dance as an art form, as an entertainment form, the French are really the masters of dance as an art, right? And in particular, do you remember when I was talking about the sort of historical background of the Baroque era, or let's say the age of absolutism, right? The sort of the general historical era. This is the time when kings were at the peak of their power, absolute monarchs, kings and queens and emperors or whatever. And one of the things that they wanted to do was to sort of project their power, their magnificence. And one of the ways they did that was sort of like through the arts, by having a magnificent palace, by having the finest art, the finest music, and maybe the finest ballet productions. So Louis XIV in particular, right, who I mentioned is sort of like the archetype of the absolute monarch of this period. Louis loved nothing better than to dance, right? There were ballets that were composed by his court composer specifically for him to be the star dancer in these ballet productions. So before he became kind of big and fat, Louis was an expert dancer, and this was just part of French culture. They loved dance. I mean, dance was very big all over Europe. really. It was one of the main sort of social activities. I think I talked about even going back to the Renaissance. If you wanted to be an educated, cultured person, sort of inhabiting these elevated realms of the high nobility, maybe in a royal court somewhere, you needed to be able to dance. You would not make it in that world, in that milieu, if you could not dance. Right? That's how important it was. So the suite really has its origins in France and spreads throughout Europe. France was in these days sort of one of the leading cultural centers, and other courts throughout Europe would imitate whatever the French would do. The French were always at the sort of the forefront of fashion, and of course all the royal courts of Europe, they would speak French. They wouldn't, in the courts of Germany, Russia, England, or whatever, the high nobility would often speak French, not English or Russian or German or whatever, because French was the language of cultured, educated people. And so, just as in fashion and in other ways, the French style of dance prevailed and was a huge influence, spread throughout the rest of Europe. In a typical French suite, there were 4 dances in particular, which were always at the core. And remember, these are imitations of dance music. It was not necessarily meant to be danced to. Some of these suites were probably meant to be actually danced to, but others were stylized dance music, music for listening to that imitated the rhythms and the tempos and the idiom of the dance. And so the titles were associated with different dances. And one of the interesting things is these different dances had different international origins, right? So the 4 dances which were usually at the core of the dance were the Allemande. And Allemande just means German. It's a German-style dance. The Courante. The word courante means, it's sort of like current. It means running. It's a faster tempo, whereas the Allemande is a moderate tempo. The courante is a faster tempo. It's a different meter. The gavotte or the minuet. This is usually somewhere in the middle of the suite, and usually the last dance would be a gigue. Gigue is just the Frenchified version of the word jig, which is an Irish or an English dance, and it's always like fast tempo, very lively. So we have contrasting national origins, contrasting tempos, contrasting meters. So, for example, an Allemande is usually in a sort of a duple meter. It's in 2 or in 4, right? The gigue is always in some kind of a compound meter, like 1, 2, 3, 2, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 2, 2, 3, something like that. And again, these correspond to the different dance steps. And everybody knew these dance steps. These cultured, educated people knew these different dance steps. So they would hear, they wouldn't even really need to, as soon as they heard the characteristic tempo and meter of, let's say, an Allemande or a courante or a gavotte or a minuet or a gigue, they would instantly think, they would sort of like be dancing it inside even as they're listening to it, even if they're just sitting down listening. Right, so this is the appeal of the gigue, of the suite. And the idea is we have contrast of meter, of tempo, of national origin. We have different melodic material in these different movements. But all of these different movements would be in the same key. So if you're writing a suite, let's say in the key of G, all the different movements would be in the key of G. And they would also generally be in the same form. A very simple form called binary form. Binary form just means you have an A section and you have a B section. So that's your contrast. And each of these sections would repeat. So it's really A, B, B, right? So that way we have some repetition because each section repeats, but we have 2 different sections, so we have some contrast, some variety. Usually when you do the repeat, you would add little embellishments, little improvised decorations to the melody. they might be improvised or they might even be written in by the composer. So you didn't play it exactly the same way when you repeated the A section or when you repeated the B section, right? So each of these different movements would be in the same form, the different dance-like movements of the suite. And again, the core of the suite would be those 4 movements, but as time went on, composers sometimes added additional movements. And sometimes a suite would start out with a prelude. Right? Now the prelude, again, it would be in the same key, but it's a little different because it's sort of like an introductory piece. The prelude is usually not dance-like. Right? It sounds kind of like a warm-up, right? And it's usually not in binary form. It will be in it's very often sort of quasi-improvised. It sounds as if it's being made up on the spot, even if it was written out. And in those days, performers could improvise these types of preludes, but sometimes a composer would write out a prelude as the first movement of a suite. And this is kind of optional, but if we have, let's say, a prelude, and then we have the 4 dance-like movements, maybe 1 or 2 additional movements thrown in, we might have a piece that has 7 movements, right? So usually a suite has between 4 and 7 movements. And again, it could be for solo instrument, could be for small group, could be for orchestra. The example of the suite which is in your book, it's, again, I mentioned it's a little atypical because it's an orchestral suite, and it has some different titles. I kind of wish they hadn't chosen this one because it's not like a very typical example, but it's one that has this very familiar second movement, the air. Air, by the way, just means song or aria. So this one starts with an overture. Overture and prelude basically mean the same thing. It's a piece that comes before something else. Usually we use the word overture to describe the piece that comes at the beginning of an opera. Usually at the beginning of a suite, the title might be prelude. And then the second movement in this case is an air. That is sort of like an aria. It's song-like rather than dance-like. The third movement is a gavotte. The gavotte is one of these dances. Fourth movement is a bourrée, again, another French-type dance. And the fifth movement is a gigue. Let's see if, I'm not sure if in your listening we have the this air as a listening example. Let's look and see if we can find it. And maybe we'll just play it on the way out, if it's in there. Okay, let's scroll down and see. Oh. Yep, I think all the different movements are in there. Here it is. The beautiful, it's known as the air on the G string. It's not that kind of G string. It's the lowest string on the violin, playing the note G. That's not what Bach titled it, but that's what it's been known as for a very long time. The air on the G string. So rather than being dance-like, this movement happens to be more song-like. It's an aria. That's what the word air means. It's like the English version of the word aria, which we learned about in opera, right? An aria is just a song. And in this case, the melody is played by a violin. And we're coming to the end of the A section. So we repeat the A section. Sounds like the beginning, right? So we're starting over at the beginning. But you'll hear there's some little embellishments. There's some little decoration thrown into the melody. Since we're hearing the same basic material, we don't want to play it the exact same way. We want to decorate it a little bit. Put some ornaments in there. There was one just now. And then we'll move on to the B section, which begins right here. And I'll let you listen to the rest of that on your own. And next time, we'll talk about the fugue. See you then.